Hello and welcome to the Roland XP-80 Video Owner's Manual. During the course of the video, I intend to show you everything you need to know in order to get up and running quickly and efficiently. Be sure, however, to keep your owner's manual close to hand, as we will be referring to it from time to time. So without any further ado, let's take a brief overview of the unit. The XP-80 is a fully self-contained music production system. It's really three components put together in one box. We have the sound source, the sequencer and the controller. The sound source uses digital technology to give us a whole range of different instrument sounds, and these are controlled using special commands called MIDI messages. We can also control the sound source from an external controller using the MIDI in socket. Okay, what about the sequencer? Well, the sequencer can be thought of much like a tape recorder, and we can use it for building up multi-instrument compositions. Data from the keyboard is recorded directly to the sequencer and retransmitted to the sound source. And finally, we have the controller section. What do I mean by the controllers? Well, one controller is the keyboard. We also have some secondary controllers over here, things like pitch bend, modulation, assignable controllers like C1, C2, the sound palette, and also some foot switch control pedal inputs on the rear of the unit. All of these can be used to control the sounds in real time in one way or another. Well, let's now take a closer look at the front panel. And bear in mind that everything I show you now will be covered in much greater detail later on in the video. Well, starting over here, we find the built-in disk drive. Using the drive, we can store songs, sounds, as well as a whole range of other things directly to one of these, a standard 3.5-inch floppy disk. Very inexpensive and efficient storage medium. Underneath the drive we have the master volume control, as well as C1 and C2 user-definable control sliders. And underneath that we have the ubiquitous pitch bend and modulation controller. Now, on the front panel here you can see that the controls are divided up with thin white lines. Each section does a different job. Over here we have the sound palette. This allows us to make real-time changes to any of the sounds we're playing without making any permanent change to the sound. It's simply a performance tool. Over here, the key effects will define how the keyboard controls the sounds. Over here we can select the various modes of operation of the XP-80. And this huge LCD display gives us all the information we need when we're editing and performing. And underneath the display you can see a range of function buttons. Well, these are actually soft keys, which means their particular function differs depending on the particular page that we have to be viewing. Underneath we have buttons for tone, patch and performance selection. Over here we have the sequencer controls. And finally, a numerical keypad which we can use for data entry, or alternatively the value dial, which allows us to make changes to parameter values. And of course, last but not least, we have the 76-node keyboard. So looking at the rear panel, starting from this side, first we see the AC inlet. Nice not to have external power supply units, everything's built in. Moving along, we have the control pedal inputs. These can be used for switched control operation or continuous control with an expression pedal such as the EV5. 4 of these, and they're totally user assignable, so you may, for example, want to use a switch to speed up or slow down the Leslie speaker cabinet speed. Here we have the hold pedal, which is like a standard sustain input, and then MIDI in, out and through. So we can hook up to external MIDI sound sources if we wish to use the XP-80 as a controlling keyboard, or we can bring in information to control the internal sound source. And we can even use the built-in sequencer to control other MIDI sound modules. Okay. Over here we see an output for the click and also a level control for that click. What is the click? Well, when you're playing along with the built-in sequencer, sometimes you need some audible cue to make sure you stay in time. It's particularly handy when you're working with a real drummer and you want him to play along to pre-arranged sequences, as he can simply monitor the click and play along in time. Then we see the outputs. Well, I'm using master output mix left and right. We also have a set of outputs called direct left and right, and this is like a subgroup output. Handy if you want to direct some of the internal sounds to this output for external processing, things like drum sounds, bass sounds, and so on. you can actually create a sub-mix. Also very handy for monitor mixes. And then finally we have the headphone socket. So we're now ready to power up. Over to the switch and switch on. If you keep watching the display, you should see a friendly boot up routine. This is just an initialization procedure. Okay, well, don't worry too much about what the display is showing at this point. What we're going to do is have a listen to an internal demonstration. Okay, if you look over here, you can see the sequencer and chain play buttons, and shown underneath the word demo. Press these two buttons together and a prompt appears. Demo play OK question mark. Well, F5, function key number 5, lines up with the box marked OK. So if I press it just once, the demo tune is loaded into the sequencer. Now normally sequencers are loaded from disk, but in this special case it's loaded from an internal memory chip. And you can hear the music playing back. Well, there are one or two things you can experiment with. Over here is shown the measure number, that's the bar position within the song. And below that is shown the tempo of the song in beats per minute. Now, at the moment, the tempo value is highlighted. And using these cursor controls here, up, down, left, and right, I can select which parameter to access. So let's try changing the tempo using the value dial or the increment, decrement buttons. I can change the tempo in real time. Let's just move to the measure counter for a moment. Now over here, stop play. Press it once to stop the track, press it again to restart the track. When I'm stopped, I can move to a different bar position. Alternatively, I can move directly to the beginning of the track by holding down Shift backward, or straight to the end, Shift forward, or just by pressing these buttons on their own, move in increments or decrements of one measure. Now just a word of warning, there's a feature called MIDI update. If you're moving to a point within a sequence, you may find that previous data, either affecting the sounds, the patches, performance effects, whatever it might be, may not have been read up to that point. So we need to use MIDI update, which means that basically it corrects for every event up to that point. And to do that, we hold down Shift and stop. MIDI update, and we get a progress report in terms of a percentage of completion. There we go, MIDI update complete. That means now the track will play back exactly as it was intended from that point. Well, I'll now leave you to listen to the demo tune in your own time. The XP-80 contains 640 basic sound configurations called patches, and these are the sounds that you would use in performance. Well, to access these sounds, we first need to move to the patch mode. So, in this section here, you see a button marked patch. Press it just once, and the display will change. We're now in the patch mode, and we know this because firstly the patch light is lit, and in the top left-hand corner of the display we see patch. Now, in bold, in the display we see the patch name, in this case user 001, and the name of the patch is West Coast. And if you play the keyboard now, you should hear sound directly. Okay, well we can move through the various patches just rotating the dial here, and as I do so you see the patch name change. Now these 640 patches are divided up into 5 different groups. There's the user group, there are preset groups A, B, C, and also a special general MIDI group. In each group there is 128 different patches. Now preset groups A, B and C are, as the name would suggest, factory presets which cannot be overwritten. Those sounds are there and they will never be changed. It is possible to modify them and store them elsewhere. And in fact, where you would store your own modifications is in the user set. So the user patches, 1 to 128, can be overwritten, rewritten if you like, or edited to your heart's content. The general MIDI bank is a special bank which is a collection of sounds that adhere to the general MIDI standard. So if you're using general MIDI files on disk or externally via MIDI, the GM sound set will be automatically called up. So for the time being, let's not worry too much about the GM sounds. Okay, well each patch can be further broken down into its component parts. Each patch can be made from up to 4 tones, and the tones are the most fundamental building blocks of sound within the XP-80. Each tone is a discrete waveform, if you like, a digital sample, and we can further select those waveforms when we're editing the patch. Well, it's all very well selecting the patches using the value dial, like this. However, this can be a bit slow and laborious. We can speed up the action of the value dial by holding down the Shift button, and this means we can move through in groups of 10. And this not only works when selecting patches, it works when editing any parameter value within the machine. Okay, so that's a little tip. Alternatively, if you want a slightly more direct access, you can use the numeric keypad over here. The patch group, whether it be user, preset A, preset B, and so on, is selected by holding down Shift plus a number. Shift 4 gives us the GM set, Shift 1, preset A, and so on. Once the group is selected, we then select the patch number directly by dialing it in. 25, for example, a box appears around the patch name, and we can confirm selection by pressing Enter. And that's now selected that particular patch. Okay, still further methods for patch selection. A lot of Roland users are familiar with a completely different way of organising patches, the 8x8 system, often used on early Roland synthesizers, where you had 8 banks of 8 patches, giving you a total of 64 sounds immediately accessible. Well, we can treat the XP-80 patches in exactly the same way, and at the top of the screen here you see the patch number 25. An alternative patch number is also shown, subgroup A, bank 4, sound 1. Using this button here, A, B, C, D, I can toggle between subgroups, or sub-banks, A and B, and then select patches subsequently. So if I want to go to B88, 8, 8, I select it directly. Okay, so B88 is the equivalent of patch 128. It's just a different way of working. Finally, we have an interesting feature called Sound List. This button here, press it once, and we can call up a display which shows the patch memory in groups of 10. You can see buttons here marked -10, +10. And this is a very convenient way of seeing the different patch types named. We can also change the group by using group plus and minus. Simply by rotating the dial, we can then move through the listing, and we will hear the sound that we see. And so on. Very, very easy, very user-friendly. Now it's possible to globally transpose the keyboard. Take a look at the display. We see 2 things here. Octave 0, center C4. Well, octave 0 just means that we have no shift. We're at the original key position. Center C4 means when I press this key here, which is normally C4, I hear C4. Using these controls here, I can shift up plus or minus 3 octaves. So let's use this button here, marked plus octave. And you can hear the octave shift, or down. Now the display reads octave -1, center C3. This means when I press the key C4, I hear the note C3. So let's just return that to C4. I can also transpose in semitone steps by holding down transpose and one of the other 2 buttons. So I can transpose the keyboard up a semitone, and so on, or down in semitone steps. And you know when the keyboard is transposed because the transpose button has a little light which comes on. Okay? And you can switch transposition off just by pressing that button once more. The XP-80 is a polyphonic instrument, which means it can play back more than 1 note at a time. This is great for piano sounds, string sounds, guitar sounds, and so on. However, if you're trying to emulate the sound of a monophonic instrument, which is an instrument that can produce only 1 note at a time, something like a flute or a trumpet, then we can simulate this effect using the solo facility. And here's the button. Under key effects, it's marked solo. Firstly, without solo engaged, this trumpet sound Okay, well it can sound rather unnatural if all of those notes are playing at the same time. If I switch solo mode on and play exactly the same thing, still holding all of the notes down, we find we get last note priority, but monophonic, so only the last note that was played is sounded. And this is great because if you're playing lots of fast stuff with a monophonic sound, we can end up with a much more natural and expressive representation of what that instrument should be. Now, the solo control is actually part of the patch, which means that if I change patches to a different patch which doesn't use the solo facility, the solo light will go out. Okay? It's not a global control, it's patch dependent. I find the solo feature particularly useful on bass sounds. I've got a bass sound in here, it's preset B, 83. And because of the last note priority, it means we can get away with playing some more complex bass lines very, very easily. Play a note, add a note, and it makes playing that kind of part much, much more easy since I really only have to play or add each note as I need it to be played. Portamento is an effect that was often featured on early monophonic synthesizers, and it allows us to generate a pitch glide between successively played notes on the keyboard. Let's try it out with this sound first of all. User 043. This is played without portamento. Portamento switched on. Now you can hear the way the notes glide from the first to the second to the third. Particularly useful in conjunction with the solo control. We can change the nature of the portamento, how it responds to the way you play, as well as the speed. So we can have a very quick glide or a very, very slow glide. Okay. Well, it's also very handy when creating things like violin glissando, and certain wind instruments have a particular pitch glide on their transient just when the note starts. So once again, we can use portamento very subtly to create a lot of real sounds. The XP-80 has a very important feature known as the sound palette, which allows us to modify any of the sounds we're playing in real time during live performance. We can address various parameters, and these are defined by these two buttons up here. Okay, well let me draw your attention to the display. I've called up a sound here which is user 015, exactly the same in your machine, so try it out. And it sounds like this. Great sound, and it's made up of 4 tones, 4 elements if you like. And the reason I know this is because the display shows tone 1, 2, 3, 4. So this patch uses all 4 tones. Now, if I go over to my sound palette and I press the button marked level, it immediately turns these controls into level faders, 1 for each of the 4 tones. So let's whack these ones down, leaving just number 1. Bring it down, fade up number 2, 3, and 4, showing me the 4 component tones of the patch. So I can rebalance the patch if I need to live. Alternatively, let's press this button instead, filter envelope. Now the 4 controls give me access to changes of cutoff frequency of the filter, the resonance of the filter, and also the attack and decay times of the envelope of the sound. What is a filter? Well, a filter is a simple process whereby certain frequencies can be emphasized or de-emphasized. And the strength or effect of that process is controlled by the resonance here. So let me play the sound and change the cutoff frequency of the filter, making it brighter or darker. Or the resonance, this makes the sound much more peaky. If I now change the cutoff again, you hear a much more intense effect. Back off the resonance, and we get a more mellow effect. Okay, let's just reduce that and open the cutoff. Now I'm going to alter the attack time of the sound. You can see as I increase the attack time, the sound fades in. Or a very short attack, the sound starts instantaneously. And the same can be done with the decay. If I increase the decay, it means that when I release the key, the sound carries on playing for a predetermined amount of time. That's a long decay, short decay, and so on. So a very handy tool, but bear in mind that all of these changes are just temporary. If I reselect the patch, then all of these changes are lost. The XP-80 contains 3 discrete effects processors. And down here we see the master switches for those processors. Now, each patch contains its own effect settings, but these control whether the effect is active for the whole machine. Again, a global control. So let's take a basic sound. Here's a piano sound. I'm going to add the reverb effect. This serves to simulate the acoustics of a small hall or a room, and we can change the settings of the reverb independently. Let's try the chorus effect. You see how much that thickens up the sound using subtle modulation. Really great for pad sounds. And finally, the EFX section. We have a choice of 40 different EFX types. Some of them are single effects, like distortion or rotary speaker simulator, and others are combinations of effects, multi-effects, in actual fact. Well, I've got a great patch here. It's preset bank C, sound 115, and you should have exactly the same sound in that location. Brilliant sound. Make sure all the effects buttons are on, and take a listen to the sound. Remove the effects. You can see what a dramatic effect that has on the sound. Also, you may have noticed that visual confirmation of the effects on or off status are not only given by the buttons themselves, but in the LCD, EFX, chorus, reverb as shown as little icons. So as I switch them in and out, you can see the icons appear and disappear. Having listened to the built-in patches of the XP-80, you may well have found one or two that you could use for a particular application. However, these may not be quite what you want, and you may need to change the patch in some way. Changing the patch is called editing the patch, and the XP-80 allows you to edit in an incredibly detailed way. However, at this stage, let's just take a look at one or two very basic edits that you might like to make. Well, this is one sound that I have selected, preset bank B, sound 077. It sounds like this. Now, this patch consists of 3 tones, and once again I know this because the display shows tone 1, 2, 3, with a dash where the 4th tone would normally be. Have a look at these buttons here. These are the patch selection buttons, which we looked at earlier on, but these have dual function. If I go into edit mode, and I can do that by pressing any of the function keys, I'm going to press F1, which is patch common. These buttons now control the tone on or off status within the patch. And you can see shown underneath the buttons here, tone switch. And buttons 1, 2 and 3 are eliminated, button 4 is not. I can use these buttons to switch the 3 tones either on or off within the patch. So you can hear the various components of the patch. Now I want to remove permanently the breathy component, which is tone number 3. Leaving the purer sound of this particular synth. So that's now been done. Right, I can make as many edits at this point that I want. So the next thing I'm going to do is add the portamento and solo functions. Again, remember earlier we talked about how temporary these effects were, but when we're editing, we can make them permanent. We can store them within the patch. So they're now switched on. The last thing I'm going to do is change the patch level. Now, at any point when you're editing, pressing the exit button will take you back to the main play page. But you'll notice, at this point, I have an asterisk next to the patch name. This means that the patch has now been changed in some way. Not permanently, not until I store it. But let's go to patch level. So now I can change the relative balance between a set of patches that I have set up. The master level over here controls the output of the whole machine. The patch level controls the relative level of the patches within the machine. So, once again, press F1. This takes me into patch common. Now, patch common parameters are parameters common to the whole patch, i.e. affecting all 4 tones simultaneously. And you can see here at the top, we have the patch name, Below that we have the patch level. So using my cursor controls, down one step, I can access the patch level. And altering the level with the alpha dial allows me to make a permanent change to the level of that patch. Okay. Now I'm going to do one last edit, and that's change the name of the patch. So back up to the top. If I press F1 again, I can open up a keyboard display, and using the cursor controls and the alpha dial, I can rewrite the name of the patch. So under F6 here you see delete. I'm going to get rid of the old name and create my own. Scrolling along with the alpha dial, select the letters you want. Once you've selected the correct letter, press next. V, O, M. And once you're happy with the name, press exit to get back to the main play page. Now, remember, I've made these edits, but the patch has not been changed permanently. If I reselect the patch, it will revert to its previous conditions. So the next thing I have to do is write the patch into memory. This is the same procedure that you'll use to store sounds in any other part of the keyboard, but because we're in patch mode, it means we're going to be writing to the patch user memory. Remember, presets A, B, and C are preset only. You cannot change those. We're going to use the user memory locations to store this sound. Press Utility, and you can see from menu 1, 5 options. Well, option number 1 is write, so that's what we want. Write is selected. I then press the Enter button down here. The display shows me source, temp. Well, this is the temporary memory area. Now, any edits that are made within the temporary memory area. That is everything that is currently being played by the keyboard. And I'm actually going to save this sound into user memory location 077. If I want to, I can change that location to reorder my patches. Often it's nice to have your 8 favorite patches stored within these memory locations here. So let's actually store this in user 001. Source, temporary, destination, user 001. It shows me the name of the destination patch, the patch that I'm going to be writing over, as well as the name of the temp source, which is VOM, the one that I just created. Press execute under F6. It won't work until we switch the memory protect off. So I'm prompted here, it says, warning, you're write protected. So this is simply a protection tool for the whole machine, so I can't actually overwrite any of the previously stored patches. Let's switch that to off. Press enter. It says press execute to write as before, but this time it's stored permanently. And if I change patches, go back, you can see that the patch is now stored permanently. And I can switch the unit off, reboot, and it will still be there. So that's a basic edit procedure. Now, if you switch the write protect facility off, it remains off until it's switched on once more. Don't worry, however, about overwriting some of the user patches because they can be recalled from internal ROM memory using a feature called initialize. Let me show you how you do it. Go into utility mode by pressing the utility button once, and again we see menu 1 options. This time, cursor down to where you see initialize and press enter. And you'll see the mode of initialization. We have a choice, default and preset. Well, let's first try default. F6 execute. What this has done is it's returned user patch 001 to an initialized state, which means it's reset everything to 0, if you like. A basic piano waveform for tone number 1. And there is only a single tone in this patch now. All of the effect settings are set to 0 or optimum, and all of the patch parameters have been optimized or reset in some way. Okay, again, this is temporary. If I reselect the patch, I get back my stored user patch 001. An alternative initialize is to recall the factory patch that was in that location when you first powered up the machine. Again, utility, initialize. This time, rather than mode default, we select mode preset, F6, execute. And now you see the original patch returned. It's still not permanently stored in this position. To do that, we go back and write it. just as before. Write, execute. User 001 West Coast. So we've returned the unit to the original patch 1.